What if the people you trusted most turned out to be the ones who betrayed you the deepest? Pushed off a cliff by her own nephew and abandoned by the husband she once loved, Sophia thought it was all over until she woke up years in the past. Now, with a second chance at life, she's determined to rewrite her fate, expose the lies, and rise above the ashes. But can she outsmart a family that's willing to destroy her for their own greed? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twists in Sophia's journey of revenge and redemption. After my sister-in-law gave birth to a son, she heard about a traditional remedy from a peddler. The seller claimed that by following the instructions, the child would grow up to be extraordinarily intelligent. I tore up the remedy and told her that it was a scam. I explained that newborns have immature immune systems and need proper nutrition while adhering to basic dietary principles. However, as my nephew grew up, he failed repeatedly in both academics and career. My sister-in-law, furious, blamed everything on me. That year, you tore up the remedy out of jealousy. You were afraid that your daughter would be outshined by my son. Now that he's unsuccessful in life, you must be satisfied, she shouted. My nephew, Matthew, harbored extreme resentment towards me. One day, while I was distracted, he pushed me off a cliff. When I woke up, I realized I had gone back in time to the day my sister-in-law received the remedy. This time, I decided not to interfere in others' affairs. Respecting their fate and focusing on living my own life seemed the most important. Matthew's grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Reed, hosted a grand banquet to celebrate Matthew's birth. My husband, Ethan, and I had just landed when his mother called. Ethan, are you and Sophia here yet? Your father, your brother, and Clara are busy with little Matthew. Come quickly to help entertain the guests, she barked. Before Ethan could reply, she hung up. Ethan looked at me apologetically. That's just how she is. When we get home, you can rest. I'll handle the guests. Exhausted, after an all-night surgery and an early flight, I didn't have the energy to respond. Lately, my department had been overwhelmed with patients, and taking time off was nearly impossible. Still, Ethan's mother had repeatedly called, demanding my presence. Sophia, she had insisted, I don't care how busy you are. This time, you must come back. If you don't, people will say that our family is at odds, and your father-in-law and I won't be able to show our faces. I was tired of hearing the same guilt-tripping speeches. Every holiday I had to spend time with my in-laws, no matter how busy I was. But when I gave birth to Emma, they didn't even visit once, using Clara's pregnancy as an excuse. Yet they went all out to throw a lavish banquet for Matthew. At the party, Mr. and Mrs. Reed beamed with pride, holding their grandson. This is the gem of the Reed family, they declared to everyone. Look at his blessed face. He's destined for greatness. One guest teased, when your eldest son passed the civil service exam, you said the same thing. Now you have 2 future officials in your family. Mrs. Reed laughed. Of course. Look at my eldest son. He's so successful. And my daughter-in-law is the daughter of the provincial hospital director. It's all thanks to our good parenting. I sat in a corner, uninterested in their boasting. Clara, holding Matthew, announced gleefully, I recently acquired a traditional remedy. A wise old herbalist assured me that it would make Matthew smarter than his peers, even surpassing his cousin. Mrs. Reed's eyes lit up. What is it? Let me see. I'll make sure our precious boy gets the best. Clara eagerly handed her the recipe. Relatives gathered around to take a look. Some scoffed, whispering that it was ridiculous to believe in such remedies in modern times. Clara, angered by their ridicule, turned to me. Sophia, you're educated and a doctor. Tell them if this remedy works or not. The memories of my past life flashed before me. The last time Clara asked me this, I had dismissed the remedy as harmful, leading to a chain of events that ultimately ended my life. This time, I smiled calmly and replied, Clara, you're Matthew's mother. You know what's best for him. Why worry about what others think? Clara's face lit up. Thank you, Sophia. I knew you would understand. She carefully tucked the remedy into her pocket and said, "Don't worry. When Matthew grows up and becomes successful, he'll help Emma too." That night, after the party ended and the guests had left, Ethan and I prepared to sleep. Unexpectedly, Mrs. Reed barged into our room without knocking. "Ethan, come with me. I need to talk to you," she demanded. I didn't even glance at her, pulling the blanket over myself and pretending to sleep. Ethan returned half an hour later and awkwardly tried to explain. "Mom didn't say much. She just asked me to take care of you and be more understanding of how hard you work." I silently laughed, knowing Mrs. Reed, those words were likely far from the truth. Early the next morning, I checked my phone and was shocked to see a bank notification. $10,000 had been transferred out of my account at 1 a.m. I immediately woke Ethan and demanded an explanation. He rubbed his eyes and muttered, "Sophia, you know Lucas hasn't had a job for months, and Clara doesn't work either. They're struggling with a newborn, and my parents have already run out of savings. I borrowed your money to help them." My anger flared. "Ethan, that money was my hard-earned salary. Do you know how many night shifts I worked and how many medical reports I wrote to save that amount? You didn't even discuss it with me before giving it away." I knew Ethan frequently sent money to his parents, and I had never complained or questioned him about his earnings. But this time, he had crossed the line. He stole my money to support his brother's family without asking me. Ethan looked stunned, as if he didn't expect me to react so strongly. "Sophia, please don't get upset. My parents are sleeping. Don't make them hear this," he pleaded, trying to hold my hand. I pulled away, grabbed my suitcase, and began packing. As soon as I opened the bedroom door, my in-laws stumbled in, pretending they had accidentally fallen into the room. "What are you doing, Sophia?" Mrs. Reed demanded. "Ethan just transferred a little money to help his brother. It's not like it won't be returned. Besides, the ingredients for that remedy Clara found are expensive. We needed the money to support Matthew's health." I calmly replied, "When has your family ever repaid the money you've taken? And why should my salary, which I earned through hard work, be given to someone else? They're not disabled. They can work for themselves." Mr. Reed turned purple with rage and shouted, "Sophia, how can you talk like that? You're part of this family. Your money is our money. Ethan giving some to his brother is perfectly reasonable." I stared at Ethan and said coldly, "Let's get divorced. I can't be a part of your family anymore." Ethan panicked and grabbed me. "Sophia, it's only $10,000. Why are you making such a big deal about this? I'll pay you back, I promise. Don't talk about divorce." I laughed bitterly. In my previous life, I had chosen to endure for the sake of my daughter, Emma, wanting to give her a complete family. I believed that Ethan, despite his excessive devotion to his family, still cared for me and our child. But when I learned the truth about my death, that he had chosen to cover up for Matthew instead of seeking justice for me, I realized I meant nothing to him. This time, I wouldn't tolerate it anymore. "I'll prepare the divorce papers. If you don't agree, we'll meet in court." With that, I left without looking back. 2 days later, Ethan returned, trying to act as if nothing had happened. He didn't bring up our argument, but instead tried to win me over with small gestures. I had already signed the divorce papers and handed them to him. Then I packed my belongings, took Emma, and moved back to my parents' house. Ethan hesitated to sign the papers, dragging out the process. For 3 months, we remained in a limbo of separation. One day, Clara called me, her voice filled with panic. "Sophia, it's Matthew. He's been sick lately, sleeping more than usual. We've taken him to several hospitals, but no one can figure out what's wrong. Can you arrange for him to be examined at your hospital?" she pleaded. At that moment, I was at the aquarium with Emma, watching her marvel at the marine life. I replied tactfully, "Clara, I'm away for a training program right now and won't be back for a few months. But isn't this the result of using that so-called miracle remedy? Surely all the expensive herbs should have prevented this, right?" There was silence on the other end of the line. When I was about to hang up, Clara spoke again, her tone sharp. You're right. I've spent so much money on Matthew. It can't be that he's sick. Those doctors must not know what they're doing. I'll go home and make more ginseng soup for him. I shook my head, deciding not to waste more time on her stubbornness. The next morning, Clara called again, her tone much calmer. Sophia, it's a miracle. Matthew is feeling better already. That remedy is truly effective. I've decided not to take him to the hospital anymore, she said triumphantly. That's wonderful, I replied dryly. But as the conversation went on, Clara shifted gears. Sophia, we need a little help. Could you lend us some money? Lucas has started working at a construction site, but we're struggling until his paycheck comes. I calmly responded, I'm sorry, Clara. My savings were wiped out the last time Ethan took money for you. I really don't have anything left. I remembered vividly what had happened in my previous life. Lucas had barely worked 6 months at the construction site before an accident left him in the ICU. He didn't survive, and the compensation money was quickly spent. Clara abandoned Matthew and disappeared, leaving my in-laws no choice but to take care of their grandson. Back then, I pitied Matthew and treated him as my own son. But in the end, he repaid my kindness with cruelty. Before hanging up, I warned Clara, construction work is dangerous. You should encourage Lucas to find a different job. Clara snapped, if you're not going to help us, at least stop with the lectures. Do you think it's easy for us? If you're so capable, why don't you find him a job yourself? She hung up before I could respond. Early in my marriage, I had tried to help Lucas multiple times. Ethan had arranged for him to work as a security guard, but Lucas got into a fight with the supervisor and was fired. My father found him a position in the hospital's supply department, but he complained about the hard labor and quit without notice. A year later, after months of separation, Ethan finally agreed to the divorce. I sold our marital home, a gift from my parents, and split the money with Ethan. He argued that he deserved compensation for the years we were married and promised not to fight for custody of Emma if I gave him half. Reluctantly, I agreed, considering it a small price to pay for peace. 3 years passed. One day, while finishing a night shift, I received a call from Emma's teacher. Apparently, she had a conflict with a classmate, and I was asked to come to the school. To my surprise, her classmate turned out to be none other than Matthew. I was stunned to see Matthew and realized he and Emma were attending the same school. It took me a moment to recognize him. He had grown significantly overweight. At only 4 years old, he was much larger than his peers. His eyes were barely visible due to his puffy cheeks, and his movements seemed sluggish and awkward. The teacher explained, Matthew fell and couldn't get up after Emma pushed him. His parents are demanding an explanation from the school. I was surprised. How could Emma, a small girl, push someone of Matthew's size to the ground? But when I looked at him, I couldn't help but think of all the so-called tonic foods Clara had fed him over the years. His body might appear robust, but it was likely fragile and unbalanced inside. At that moment, Clara entered the room, furious. My son eats only the best at home. There's no way he would steal food from others. She snapped at the teacher, dismissing accusations that Matthew had been taking food from his classmates. The teacher, trying to remain patient, explained, Clara, several parents have reported that Matthew often takes food from other children. We need to address this behavior. Clara was about to argue when she noticed me standing in the room. Her face froze in shock. Sophia, I didn't know Emma was involved, she stammered. I chose not to engage her too much and simply said, kids play and argue. It's not worth making a big deal out of it. I then asked Emma to gather her things so we could leave. As we approached the school gate, Clara stopped me. Sophia, it's been years since you divorced Ethan. He's been very kind to me and Matthew. We're getting married next month. Will you come to the wedding? She asked, trying to sound casual. I paused for a moment, processing her words. So Lucas had died, and Clara had shifted her attention to Ethan. Their relationship must have had the approval of Ethan's parents. I smiled faintly and replied, I wish you both well, but I won't be attending the wedding." Later that evening, Emma confided in me, "Mom, Matthew tries to take food from everyone at school. No one likes to play with him. But you know what? He's not as strong as he looks. I just gave him a little push, and he fell." I ruffled her hair and gently warned her, "Emma, don't get into fights. Stay away from him and be a good girl." She nodded and kissed me on the cheek. "I will, Mom." That moment confirmed my suspicions. All the years of overeating and tonics had left Matthew's body in poor condition. His outward appearance of health was an illusion. Internally, he was weak and unbalanced. Years passed, and Emma started elementary school. One day, Ethan came to visit me at the hospital. It was the first time I had seen him since our divorce. He looked weary, his hair streaked with gray. At the time, I was consulting a patient, so I gestured for him to wait outside. After finishing my shift, Ethan took me to a nearby restaurant. To my surprise, his parents were there as well, sitting at a table laden with food. I couldn't help but feel suspicious. Ethan had never shown such respect or courtesy during our marriage. "Why now? What do you need?" I asked bluntly. Ethan sighed and explained, "It's about Matthew. He's starting elementary school soon, and I want to enroll him in the prestigious White Experimental School. It's close to my work, so I can pick him up." I raised an eyebrow and replied, "What does that have to do with me? Shouldn't you discuss this with your fiancé?" Ethan hesitated, and Mrs. Reed interjected. "Clara left. That ungrateful woman ran off with some rich man, abandoning Matthew and taking all our savings. Now it's just us, and we're too old to care for a young boy." I wasn't surprised. Clara's greed and irresponsibility were predictable. Ethan continued, "The school rejected Matthew because of his poor academic performance and health. I thought you might speak to the principal, considering he's a friend of your father." I smirked, amused by the irony. The school only accepts wealthy families or exceptional students. If Matthew were truly as gifted as Clara claimed, with all those remedies, the school would have welcomed him. Mr. Reed's face darkened, and he muttered, "It's all Clara's fault. She wasted so much money on nonsense, and now Matthew is suffering." I stared at Ethan coldly. "You've spent so much effort on someone else's child, but you've ignored your own daughter. I can't help but wonder, are you sure Matthew is even your nephew?" Ethan glared at me, offended. "Sophia, Matthew is my brother's son. It's my duty to help him." I picked up my bag and stood. "I can't help you. If you're so desperate, ask my father yourself." Ethan's expression hardened as he watched me leave. I didn't look back. Over the next month, I heard nothing from him. But one evening, I was called down to the emergency room during my night shift. The ER was chaotic, with police officers standing nearby, trying to calm down two women shouting insults at each other. On a stretcher lay a woman with a bloodied forehead, her hands pressed against the wound. When she finally lowered her hands for treatment, I realized it was Clara. She froze when she saw me, her eyes filled with a mix of shame and defiance. I calmly instructed the ER staff, "It's just a surface wound. Clean it up and stitch it." The two women continued screaming, accusing Clara of being a homewrecker who had seduced a married man and destroyed their family. I finally understood. Clara had gone from Ethan to another man, only to find herself in a violent confrontation. The next morning, after finishing my shift, I passed by her room. Clara was lying on the hospital bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sensing my presence, she turned to me and sneered, "You're here to laugh at me, aren't you?" I chuckled softly. "Clara, there's nothing left for me to laugh at. You've already hit rock bottom." Her face twisted in anger. "Don't get too smug, Sophia. My son is still brilliant and will accomplish great things. You'll see." "What do you have?" "A daughter who will marry off and leave you with nothing." I shook my head, pitying her delusions. Before leaving, I advised, "Go home and take care of Matthew. He's all you have left." Years later, I would hear of Matthew again, but it wasn't through Clara. By the time Emma entered first grade, Matthew had grown withdrawn and unpredictable. His behavior alienated him from his peers, leaving him isolated. One day, the school called me to report that Matthew had jumped from the fourth floor of the school building. He was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries, internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and a traumatic brain injury. I was the attending surgeon on call and performed the emergency operation to remove the blood clots in his brain. After hours in surgery, I informed Ethan, who was waiting outside. He's stable, but the chances of him recovering fully are slim. He may remain in a vegetative state. Ethan slumped into a chair, his face pale. A vegetative state? He repeated in disbelief. I nodded. There's a small chance he could wake up, but it's unlikely. 3 days later, Matthew's heart stopped. Despite all efforts to revive him, he passed away. Clara showed up at the hospital, clutching his lifeless body and wailing uncontrollably. Matthew, I'm sorry. I'll never leave you again. Please come back, she cried hysterically. But no amount of regret could change the outcome. Matthew's death marked the end of a long chain of events rooted in Clara's selfishness and poor decisions. Watching her collapse in grief, I felt no sympathy. Instead, I walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. 2 years later, I returned from studying abroad to find that my old department head had retired. The position of department head was open, and after a competitive selection process, I earned the role based on my skills and hard work. The evening after my promotion was announced, I returned home to find 2 unexpected visitors. Ethan's parents. They brought a variety of gifts and greeted my parents politely. It was clear that their visit had a purpose beyond mere pleasantries. After some small talk, Mrs. Reed spoke up. Sophia, we've come here today with a request. It's about Ethan. Over these years, we've seen that you haven't remarried, which tells us you still have feelings for him. Why don't you 2 get back together? Bring Emma too, and we can be a family again. I was taken aback, but I remained composed. Mr. Reed chimed in. We understand that there were misunderstandings in the past, but now that Matthew and Clara are no longer part of the picture, there's nothing stopping you. Ethan truly regrets everything, and we promise to treat Emma like our own. My mother, who had been listening silently, was visibly angry. She opened her mouth to retort, but I raised a hand to stop her. Dad, Mom, please take Emma inside. I'll handle this. Once they were out of the room, I turned to Ethan's parents and smiled faintly. Is this Ethan's idea or yours? Mrs. Reed hesitated, then replied, Ethan listens to us. He knows this is the best decision. I let out a dry laugh. You haven't changed a bit. Always making decisions for others and assuming you know what's best. But let me make one thing clear. The marriage I had with Ethan was a mistake, one I won't repeat. What does he have to offer now? He's older, weaker, and still as spineless as ever. Are you expecting me to take him back out of charity? Their faces turned pale at my words. Mr. Reed stammered, Sophia, how can you say that? Ethan truly cares for you and Emma. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. You should leave. I've built a good life for myself and my daughter, and we don't need Ethan or your family to disrupt it. Goodbye. As they left, I felt a sense of liberation. The years of manipulation and betrayal were behind me. From that moment on, I resolved to dedicate myself to my career, my daughter, and my parents, those who truly mattered. I watched the sunlight stream through the windows and smiled. The dawn of a new chapter in my life had finally arrived. Ethan's parents, left with disappointment written all over their faces. I watched them retreat, feeling an unexpected sense of closure. For so many years, I had allowed their judgment, manipulation, and selfishness to weigh me down. But now I was free. In the months that followed, my new position as department head brought both challenges and fulfillment. I poured my energy into improving hospital operations, mentoring younger doctors, and establishing better care practices for patients. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't clouded by the shadows of my past. At home, my parents became my pillars of support. Watching them play with Emma in the evenings reminded me of the love and stability I wanted to provide for her. She thrived in school, always coming home with stories of her friends and teachers. One evening, as I sat at the dinner table with my parents, Emma ran up to me with a drawing. "Mom, look, it's our family," she exclaimed, pointing to the vibrant colors on the paper. There we were, my parents, Emma, and me, all holding hands under a bright sun. My heart swelled with gratitude. I smiled and said, "You're missing something, sweetheart." I picked up a crayon and drew a stethoscope around my neck. "This is part of who I am, too." Emma giggled, her eyes sparkling. "Mom, you're the best doctor ever." In that moment, I realized that my life had come full circle. The pain, betrayal, and loss I had endured were all lessons that shaped me into the person I was becoming. I wasn't defined by my past, but by the choices I made to build my future. One weekend, I decided to take Emma on a trip to the countryside. We visited a small village where the air was fresh and the scenery was breathtaking. There, I met an elderly couple running a clinic for underserved families. They had spent decades dedicating their lives to helping others, and their humility inspired me. As I watched them work, an idea began to form in my mind. Returning to the city, I began planning a community health program for children in low-income neighborhoods. It was ambitious, but I felt a fire within me. This was how I wanted to contribute to the world. Months later, the program launched with overwhelming support. Parents brought their children for checkups, advice, and health education. Emma often tagged along, helping to distribute snacks and toys to the kids. Seeing the smiles on their faces, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. On the day of the program's one-year anniversary, I stood before a crowd of supporters and volunteers. "Today isn't just about what we've accomplished," I said, my voice steady and filled with conviction. "It's about the hope we've created for the next generation. Together, we're building a future where every child has the chance to thrive." As the applause rang out, I looked at Emma, who was clapping enthusiastically in the front row. She mouthed, "I love you, Mom." I smiled back, my heart full. The road had been long and difficult, but I had finally reached the dawn of a new life. The light of a brighter tomorrow wasn't just mine. It was a beacon for everyone I could help along the way. Subscribe to Tiny Storytime for more captivating stories every day.